So please join me in welcoming this afternoon's plenary speaker, Ambassador Michael McKinley. Throughout his career, he held senior leadership positions in missions across Latin America, Europe, Africa, and Afghanistan, and concluded his service as a senior advisor to the Secretary of State. As a four-time ambassador, he led some of the largest U.S. embassies in the world, including Peru from 2007 to 2010, Colombia 2010 to 2013, and Afghanistan 2014 to 2016, and Brazil from 2017 to 2018. He brings an extensive experience with regional conflicts and peace negotiations across the three continents over 3 decades, including as ambassador in Colombia and Afghanistan. Please give a warm welcome to Ambassador McKinley.
Good afternoon, everyone. And first, thanks to Dr. Farhadi and to the Institute for the invitation, the organization. Been working on Afghanistan for many years, but certainly since the fall of Kabul, and I can say that this conference so far, and I probably won't rise to the level of discussion of this morning, but truly has been illuminating and helping us look forward after a very difficult period. I want to thank General McKenzie as well. And thanks to the audience, which includes so many students and members of the community, and a special mention to the Afghan War Commission, which is doing heroic work to illuminate the last 20 years of the history in Afghanistan. I wish them all the success going forward. And it's an opportunity also to remind ourselves, as Dr. Jackson said, of the dedication and service of over 800,000 Americans in uniform, to which we should add tens of thousands of contractors who served in Afghanistan, thousands of civil servants and State Department officials. It was a very significant commitment by our nation. And of course, at this time and always, we should remember that we are not speaking about something in the abstract. We're speaking about Afghanistan and its people, what they've been through in the past, their suffering now, our obligation to continue helping them, and especially those who worked with us across the 20 years we spent in Afghanistan. The title of this conference is Rethinking Afghanistan. And with what we've heard this morning and what we'll hear this afternoon, it is a serious attempt to understand what happened across 20 years, where we find ourselves now, and what are the implications going forward. It's in looking at what happened, and as Ambassador Khalilzad said this morning, it's not just looking at what the United States did, but how Afghans themselves responded to those last 20 years and how they're responding now to the challenges they face. I defer to the Afghan participants to speak to many of these questions. I will focus my remarks mostly on, but not exclusively, the United States going forward. Let me suggest that the original sin of American foreign policy after 9/11 was to elevate the global war against terrorism to the existential challenge to our security it never was. The last 20 years of my career were witness to how the costly conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq undermined our broader focus on global developments. In the same time frame, the rest of the world was transforming at one of the fastest rates in human history. The United States spent $3 trillion in 2 peripheral wars that cost the lives of thousands of Americans and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and Afghans. Other countries and ideologies emerged to challenge the post-Cold War status quo. We seriously underinvested in our own society. We downplayed the alliances and political and economic ties that had provided the foundations of our national security for the better part of a century. The fall of Kabul in August 2021, where I had once been ambassador, embodied the mistaken priorities of 2 decades of decision-making. General Petraeus and others have suggested that the failure in Afghanistan was a reflection of our failure of commitment. In addition to the damaging policy consequences elsewhere to our national interest of our focus on Afghanistan and Iraq, I would ask what $1 trillion plus of expenditure and the service of over 800,000 Americans in Afghanistan represents, if not an outsized commitment to a cause which was never ours to take on. A lot more went wrong in our policy in Afghanistan than during the last year and the decision to withdraw, which is what critics tend to focus on. We are supposed to look at lessons. The first should be that, contrary to popular opinion, the United States isn't necessarily bad at conflict resolution or assisting societies to emerge after conflict. We have a better history than is sometimes thought. The list of successes across the last 30 years is long. The Contadora process for Central America, quadripartite negotiations that led to Namibia's independence and the withdrawal of Cuban troops from Africa, San Egidio negotiations, which led to an end to Mozambique's civil war, peaceful dissolution of Ethiopia and Eritrea, the Dayton Accords in the Balkans, the Good Friday agreements in Northern Ireland, the Camp David Accords between Israel and Palestine, the agreement reached by the FARC insurgency and the Colombian government, the talks leading to the independence of South Sudan, the border settlement between Ecuador and Peru. We've had significant interest in some of these wars, much less than others. I mention them because it's the default position to look at us in terms of Iraq and Afghanistan and draw broad stroke conclusions. Iraq and Afghanistan were different kinds of struggles. It's a truism that the attack on 9/11 changed the United States and, to a lesser extent, the world. Our national response and the swift success of the military operation in Afghanistan suggested that the tragedy could soon be placed in a broader context of the largely still positive developments on the global stage. That did not happen. As the hubris of early military victories in Afghanistan and Iraq carried us forward, we stumbled into forever wars. We violated our own values by engaging in torture and other human rights violations. We spent $3 trillion, which could have gone to urgent domestic needs. We sent more than 2 million young Americans to fight and die in these conflicts. We sidelined global diplomacy and sought to remake the State Department for expeditionary and transformational diplomacy. We alienated allies, contributed to the destabilization of the Middle East, and overlooked emerging challenges in Russia and China. So why this history lesson? Because the failures of our 20-year engagement in Afghanistan need to be placed in the broader context if they are to be properly understood. As I have written elsewhere, and although we were largely successful in reducing the threat of terrorist attacks in the United States, we failed in our approach to counterinsurgency, to Afghan politics, and to nation building. We underestimated the resiliency of the Taliban, and we misread the geopolitical realities of the region. In light of the Taliban's rapid takeover in 2021, perhaps the most striking American misjudgment was our overestimation of the capabilities of the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. As Ambassador Jawad has noted, tens of thousands of Afghans, soldiers, and police fought and courageously defended their country across that time. But that's only part of the picture. Even without tactical American military support, the security forces should have been in a position to defend major cities and critical military installations. But the overestimation of their capabilities, which began after 2011 and the surge of American military forces in Afghanistan, typified how we approach things. In a 2013 report to Congress, we said Afghan forces were carrying out 80% of operations and had 352,000 troops. By 2014, we were reporting they led 99% of conventional operations and 99% of special operations. And only in the last years of the war did reports begin to reflect a more concerning reality, that tens of thousands of ghost soldiers were on the rolls, suggesting there was never close to 352,000, 330,000 troops. The figure was well under 30,000, under 300,000 at best. Afghan soldiers were also let down by their commanders. They were unpaid for months at a time, left exposed in enemy territory. Political leaders abysmally failed to earn national allegiance from their troops across that period. And on the battlefield, from 2013 on, the Taliban seemed to gain ground every single year, even with the death of Taliban founder Mullah Omar and his successor's assassination in 2016. My view in 2015, 2016 as ambassador was that the government would collapse in months without U.S. support. This was not a view that was widely shared in the U.S. government at the time, but does seem to turn out to have been the case. The seeds for erosion were laid early on with the failure to invest in Afghanistan's police and military in the first years after 2001, taking 10 years to build an air force, and so on. And in 2020, 2021, the failure to transfer the services of 18,000 contractors who worked with the Afghan military or to provide financial guarantees to cover the costs proved extremely damaging when the forced withdrawal General McKenzie mentioned came. Meanwhile, the counterinsurgency strategy embraced by the U.S. never demonstrated an ability to sustain gains. As former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullen, said, he opposed the extension of the U.S. surge after 2011 because, quote, if we did not have significant progress or show significant progress over the course of 18 months, then we had the wrong strategy and we really needed to recalibrate. Until the decision to withdraw, that recalibration never came. Another misjudgment relates to the weakness of regional warlords. Since 2001, there had been a broad assumption that these warlords commanded thousands of armed followers who could be mobilized quickly against the Taliban. Both the United States and the national Afghan government believed this to be the case and accommodated brutal and corrupt local leaders as a result. In fact, as Kabul fell and Afghan President Ghani appealed for assistance from these warlords, it was only to find they had no forces to rally. A sorry commentary on the state of the national government, the army, and the U.S. reading of a fragmented Afghan political reality. The United States, as General McKenzie and Ambassador Khalilzad has noted, also overestimated its ability to address another factor undermining the war effort, Taliban sanctuaries in Pakistan. On the political front, we should ask ourselves, why did an effective Afghan government fail to emerge over 20 years? Our efforts to impose a Western democratic model on Afghanistan, first at Bonn in 2001 and then through the writing of the national constitution, continued over 2 decades and was misplaced. Former Afghan President Karzai complained often about overbearing U.S. political influence. In 2014, when the U.S. brokered a government of national unity as the threat of civil war loomed, the result was an uneasy political compromise between President Ghani and Dr. Abdullah that never settled. In 2019, fewer than 2 million Afghans voted, down from 8 million just 5 years before. By the time the unity government leaders visited Washington to meet President Biden in June 2021, 2 months before the fall of Kabul, unity was non-existent, except in name. Yet many in Washington continued to assume a semblance of common purpose. Afghanistan's national political leadership never fully cohered on how best to fight the Taliban. There were tensions between regional power brokers in Kabul, between Pashtuns and minority Tajiks, Hazars, and Uzbeks. Both presidents managed ethnic representation through a spoils system rather than the promotion of a common national vision. Too often, they turned to the United States to help resolve political differences. The Taliban, by contrast, proved resilient, not just as a military and terrorist organization, but as a political movement as well. The Afghan government's efforts to reconcile with the Taliban from 2010 onwards, and the decision by the United States to begin negotiating formally with the Taliban in 2018 was a reflection of that reality. Another series of misjudgments and mistakes relate to America's ambition when it came to nation building. To American officials, much of what was being done seemed to work, from building a representative government, strengthening the legislature, delivery of social services, infrastructure investment, transformation of Afghan education with an exponential growth in the number of girls in school and of women at university and in the workplace. Millions of refugees returned to Afghanistan in the years after 2001. Yet even with these successes, we oversold the gains. There were questions of how deeply the changes that were being supported were also being supported by Afghans. And we did less than we could have about corruption, knowingly working with senior government and military figures that ordinary Afghans saw as responsible for graft and political and human rights abuses. Our counter-narcotics policy was an abject failure. The hope was that Afghanistan's economic growth would eventually allow the government to carry its own expenditures, certainly a principle advanced at donor conferences year after year, even though that clearly was never going to be the case. Finally, we misread the Taliban when we were fighting them. We misread their pledge to negotiate peace as they shadowboxed in Doha, and they never had any intention of reaching a settlement, and yet the intention for the agreement that was reached with the United States somewhat mirrored what we expected. The ultimate goal of American negotiators was to create the conditions for an orderly U.S. withdrawal. Taliban always knew that, dooming the intra-Afghan negotiations, which were supposed to lead to a unity government, to failure. I'm going to get a little more specific about the questions we should be asking ourselves. Why did we so thoroughly misrepresent what was happening on the battlefield with the Afghan security forces and with the Taliban? Why did we tolerate, all of us, Afghans and Americans, the rise of corruption that led to the theft of billions of dollars at the highest levels of government, where some of our closest collaborators were enriching themselves in daylight, and we were acting as though this was a normal state of affairs? Why did we work with human rights violators, including well-known regional warlords, political figures, security figures, to include the vice president under President Ghani? Why did we accept an electoral process in 2019, which was a fraudulent election and entrenched a Pashtun nationalist government? I could go on, but until we're ready to answer some of these questions directly, or at least discuss them, we won't be able to discuss how we arrived at the fall of Kabul in 2021 in total openness. I also want to discuss the environment in which the February 2020 withdrawal agreement was negotiated with the Taliban. This morning was the first time I'd seen Ambassador Khalilzad since 2020, but I can attest, across almost 10 months of interacting with him and the Secretary of State during the negotiations, that the deal was the best that could have been arrived at in that period. The pressures from the White House to produce an agreement and the threats to withdraw American forces from 1 month to the next were real. And so the fact is, the agreement had to be negotiated with certain U.S. objectives in mind. Final agreement did, contrary to popular opinion, have conditionalities. They were weak, they were implicit, but they were there, to include the Taliban more formally renouncing al-Qaeda and terrorist links and calling on them to engage seriously in intra-Afghan talks. At any point, the United States could have decided the agreement was not being enforced and take a different approach to withdrawal. The final actor who affected those final months was the presidential palace. One of the reasons the intra-Afghan talks never stood a chance was both because of the Taliban's refusal to properly engage, but because of sabotage by a government that never quite believed U.S. forces would leave. As for what has happened since, we have to look at the broader context of what is happening internationally as well as what's happening in Afghanistan. I don't have to reprise for this audience what the U.S. has to address. There is Ukraine, there's the strategic competition with China, there's Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, Iran, simmering tensions in the Straits of Taiwan and South China Sea. There's the issue of immigration, transformation of the American economy, and so on. In this context, to argue that Afghanistan remains an important strategic concern for the United States is not realistic. There's also the argument that Afghanistan is emerging as a new important player in a new great game where Russia, China, and the US compete for influence in Central Asia. Again, this is not entirely the picture. It's a serious misreading of strategic priorities for the United States and even for the region. Afghanistan's terrorist threat appears to be largely directed at Pakistan, and Afghanistan's reputed mineral wealth is difficult to develop in current circumstances, and in any case, sources for what it produces are multiplying worldwide. And although there's a warming trend in which some international governments are increasing ties with the Taliban, most countries, in fact, I don't believe there's a single country of 190 plus countries in the world that has recognized the Taliban. And as a former historian, I can say I don't remember a single equivalent case in modern history. So something is a challenge in terms of deciding how to work with the Taliban moving forward. In Washington, Afghanistan has been downgraded, and we can all speak about what is wrong with Afghanistan and Taliban rule now. We can look at what's happened in the past, but the challenge for the community of experts and citizens who continue to care about Afghanistan, the issues really are narrowing down to a few more modest objectives. So I'm going to try to look forward here. What we have been trying to do over the last 4 years is first, sustain enough of a capability to monitor and, if necessary, respond to a terrorist threat emanating from Afghanistan, and if it does, holding the Taliban accountable. Second, as was discussed in the humanitarian panel earlier, there is an urgent requirement and a sustained requirement to respond to the humanitarian needs of the Afghan people. Third, it's clear that indirect channels of communication are being kept open in case the Taliban decides to have a change of heart. And for those who would question that, I would point to the fact that channels in situations of conflict are extraordinarily important. If we just take a look at the negotiations which go on in Qatar related to the conflict in Gaza and Israel at the moment. It's critical to continue meeting and supporting Afghan opposition and diaspora figures. Critical to continue looking to how to assist Afghan women and girls. And close to the heart of many of the people in this room, critical to finalize what's known as the Special Immigrant Visa Program for all the Afghans who worked with, ended up being exposed because they supported us in Afghanistan and are still outside. There's a backlog of 70,000 being processed at the moment, but there's tens of thousands more who should be considered. So I would suggest there's scope for doing more, even with limited resources. First, it's not just support the diaspora. The diaspora is busy trying to build up its own channels, its own agendas, its own political strategies for engagement with the Taliban, with the Afghan civil society, Afghan population, with regional countries, and they need greater support, not just through UN-sponsored Doha talks and good offices and dialogues that are sustained, but something more substantial. Second, humanitarian assistance, the trend line is downwards, and there's significant shortfalls building up, and every effort should be made to reverse that trend. But unfortunately, keeping in mind that there are other crises in the world right now that are attracting attention and resources, from Sudan to Palestine and Haiti. Third, there's the work with third parties, with regional governments, with European partners, to continue looking for the openings and to see if there are opportunities to engage with the Taliban. And I'm not giving away any secrets. to say there's a constant debate over whether splits are developing inside the Taliban, which suggests there could be a change inside the country sometime in the future. But let me close by going back to the powerful documentary we saw this morning and the excellent discussion of the panel on human rights. There's simply no excuse for not continuing to focus with a laser on the Taliban's systematic and intensifying efforts to erase any trace of women and girls in Afghanistan. There's no excuse for simply adding women and girls to a list of the concerns we have in Afghanistan on counterterrorism, humanitarian requirements, and so on. It is the principal concern, or should be, for the international community. And it's not, as the euphemism goes, about gender apartheid, at least not for anyone who's worked on South Africa and other places that have seen the term applied. We are fighting the modern equivalent of bondage, the disappearance of half the human race. The international community cannot stay silent. We cannot sit there and reference back to international agreements on the rights of women and girls and hope something's going to change. We must stay engaged on this issue, raise it every time we can. This is the human rights issue of our time. And so for those who are suggesting, or if we see moves in the future to legitimize, let alone recognize the Taliban government, we have the strongest argument of all against taking any step to making it easier for the Taliban until they address what they've done to women and girls. Thank you very much.